Well, hello. Um, yeah, I usually don't wear these glasses, but I mean, I look it, but I'm of the age where I'm beginning to need to wear them for optical reasons. But it, Peterson does not show up much in my timeline, or at least he did, because I'm not a big fan of his. I don't typically seek out his content. It just happened to kind of flop into my timeline, amongst all the videos about AI art and uh, storytelling and, well, more or less my normal interests. Is that better? I hope that's better. Okay, so yeah, I'm not the awkward and me go quite well, quite hand in hand together. Um, if I tried to pretend like I'm a socially graceful individual, I would be lying and lying in a way that was transparent and pointless. I am on the spectrum. I was diagnosed with um, autism, an autism spectrum disorder, Asperger's syndrome. At the time, was the label. Um, I was diagnosed back in 1993, so that's way before it became trendy to be diagnosed as such. So it's let me tell you something about being diagnosed as such. It was a relief, and not because it didn't it meant I no longer had personal responsibility for my behavior. That's not the case. But more because there were things that I had tried all my life to do that no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't fit in. I just couldn't, anticipate what other people were thinking, what other people were feeling. I wanted to be empathetic, in the sense that, I wanted to be able to not offend people, not cause people, you know, offense or pain and suffering. Because I actually feel the, sort of the, oh crap, I've done something wrong here, sort of uh, feeling from that. I you know, I I don't have the benefit of being the sort of person who, because they don't really feel that sort of sense of that person's mood or what could hurt them, because they don't have that sensitivity, they just don't care. I'm not that kind of person. I do care, but I do care when I make that sort of mistake. I just don't see it coming though. So it was sort of, I felt bad about, and I felt humiliated about all the ways in which things just didn't seem to work. And I think that is one of the fundamental things that needs to be understood about autism spectrum disorders. This is not about just the surface behavior. You know, there are ways in which you can put somebody on Ritalin or other stimulant type drugs to kind of get them to have that sort of to get work done and stay on task. You can do that, but I found from personal experience that it didn't affect the kinds of things that were the heart of what I would consider the disabling side of my condition. And that's one approach I have in my philosophy to this is that it's a condition that happens to have both disabling and enabling sides to it. Sides to it that make me less able to do things that I would like to do that would be useful for me to do, and sides that allow me to do things other people either might find too tedious, might require too much hyper focus, too much, sensitivity. I can pick up things that other people might overlook. I can imagine things in a, you know, very high detail way that other people might not be able, to. It might take them more concentration, more. Um, I think in pictures. It is the most efficient way that I think things out. Verbalizing stuff inside my head, that's not a consistent element of my existence the way it might be with other people. So, okay, let's get into what kind of brought me into this. One of the first things that came up was Temple Grandin. Um, and one of the first things that made me just, this needs a response was Temple Grand, he says that, Temple Grandin's parents brought her out of her autism and, when they were raising her. And it's sort of as somebody who was, this because I was born prematurely. So afterwards, because of the possibility of neurological issues from that premature birth, they basically, kept a close eye on me. You know, they had sort of preschool sort of, you know, monitoring and, you know, teaching, and I guess you would call it therapy these days. But they did their best to try and get me up to normal function on things, and that's sort of par for the course if we're talking about circa early 1980s, um, education for somebody like me. And there was this notion that I might grow out of the condition. But as I've looked further and further into it, the truth of the matter is I might mature and adapt in ways that would allow me to kind of no longer present some of the symptoms, or have some of the problems, but that's not the same thing as no longer having autism uh, any more than somebody being able to read lips means they're no longer deaf. It just means that they're capable now of understanding what people are saying, uh, even though they can't hear what the person is saying too well. It's still doesn't do away with sort of the disabling aspect of not being able to hear what they're saying directly, but it's a you can build sort of compensating sort of skills and behaviors that allow you to get past some of the issues. Um, and in the same way, you can have somebody who learns Braille as a way to be able to read as a blind person, or who has audio text sort of things going on. It doesn't mean that the person no longer has a disability in that respect, but more like that they have found a way to get to function their way past that particular issue, that particular symptom. And I think that's important because we have to understand what autism is on a basic level. And all the indications are that this is an architectonic condition, that this is basically a result of an emergent result of the way the neurons got wired in the cortex and in other places in the brain. The brain is wired different. So, you can teach a person how to function better. You can struggle past, what um, the challenges that a disability poses for teaching that person how to live and how to function. But they are still the way they are. Now, this is no reason to mistreat or stigmatize them, because we have to realize something. And I'm going to come back to this point again and again, and that is that while some of us, refer to other people as being neurotypical, sort of a shorthand for those who are not on the autism spectrum or not on some other part of whatever, you know, spectrum, the truth of the matter is there is no such thing as an average brain. And I'm going to get back to this later on, but it's a point that needs to be made because we need to stop acting as if, what is essentially a statistical sort of cluster that happens to compose most individuals in a society. We have to stop acting as if that statistical cluster represents something prototypical, you know, like there is a model of human being that, a superior model that is well designed and, functions exactly like it needs to function. We need to realize that most people have something unusual going on about in the way their brain functions. But it's sort of like it's these are, small traits, bunch of small traits that come together to create something that to add up to these conditions. Okay, so he kind of talks about symbols and iconicity of, w- what's going on when a child draws a picture of a house. And it's something that I picked up on because it sort of tells us something about Peterson's overall approach to things. Uh, because he is coming from that perspective that there is some sort of, that there is an objective set of symbols out there, and you know, that we work by kind of composing things and passing them. But we need to start with an understanding of why does a kid put smoke in a chimney? Well, in part because it's conventional. They've seen other kids do the same. Also, they've seen smoke coming out of a chimney, and it does provide a point of visual interest. There's a good feeling that comes from elaborating, a picture of, sort of adding elements to make the picture more interesting. And a chimney without smoke coming out of it, that's not altogether too interesting. So add the smoke coming out of the chimney, and it you know and we have to realize that a lot of kids who would draw smoke coming out of a chimney probably are northern kids. You know, Petersen's Canadian, so people would actually use their fireplace a lot more in those areas as opposed to kids down south here. Um, but it's also there's he talks about, oh well, no house looks like that. No, because a kid doesn't have the sophistication of you know a child. Even an adult, if you asked most adults um, to draw you their house from memory, they would not necessarily do a very good job of it. Drawing things, conceptualizing things in in a way that allows a sophisticated, true to life, you know, laying out of the parts of the house or the parts of people for that matter. You know, if I'm trying to draw a hand or an arm, I mean, as an adult, I'd probably have a more sophisticated sort of skill at drawing the separate parts, the hands, the fingers, and everything. Um, but but as somebody who's not necessarily that well trained or well practiced in in the art, um, my brain is just not organized at the moment, right now, to kind of go, okay, we need to show the roof sloping off this way, and then there's a peak and a gable here, and then there's the chimney right here, and the chimney is made out of brick, or maybe the chimney is not made out of brick. Maybe it's just a metal thing sticking out of the roof. And there used to be turbines on the roof around, sort of spinny sort of um, vents. There aren't those anymore. After number of roof replacements. But the kind of the processing that you need to kind of abstract and figure out these individual parts the of what you're drawing, to the ability to figure out what to reduce, what to compress, how to kind of break things apart, and then tape them back together after you've done that. That is a skill in and of itself. And as a person who has some artistic training in the video and film arena, some idea about composition, some idea about how to frame things. Um, I can tell you that people don't necessarily think all these things through. It's why, if you hand an average person a video camera, it's going to be too shaky. It's going to focus on things that aren't really relevant. It's, you know, they're going to cross the 180-degree line, which, you know, if you asked somebody off the street to do a video of a scene, much less to write that scene out, they would not break things down in such a way as to present it in a way that is what we come to expect from a professional. You know, like if somebody draws a person's face, the shading, the shape of the parts, the way the eyes, the proportions of the eyes, the nose, the cheeks, the hairline, the color of the hair, the line of their shoulders. These things would not a person wouldn't think, oh, well, I've got to make sure of this. I've got to make sure of that. We look at things, especially in communications fields, we look at things with a finer, if we're professional, we look at things with a finer degree of sophistication as to how we treat the individual parts. And that's why it's important how you abstract things, what you abstract, how you cross section the your system as a whole, whatever you're doing. If you're sketching somebody, you're, from a description or from a photo reference, you're going to use different skills to try and represent different parts of what we perceive as the appearance of a person. Particularly if you're drawing somebody, getting that shading right, getting those nuances right is key to creating a photorealistic or at least aesthetically pleasing result. It's, but a kid just growing up, they're not ashamed necessarily of the fact that they're not creating, you know photorealistic, shaded, fully shaded, portraits of people. They're not altogether too put out by it. They just want to represent things. They just want to symbolize things. And when their parents go, "Oh, that's a nice picture," there's a part of their brain that's going to kind of, say, "Oh, ah, okay, I'll do more of this." This is part of how children learn. They want to please. A lot of children want to please adults, and so they'll, they don't, they want to represent something, and they want to, and if they're given the chance to do that, they'll want to kind of present the, adults with, okay, this is my home, this is my dog, this is my brother and my sister and my younger sister, or so on and so forth. They are connecting to the elements that are important in their life and trying to connect that to the person, the adult who asked them to, or let them do some drawing. So but they don't have the sophistication to know, oh, you need, the arms are mostly straight, like they have bones in them, so they're not necessarily going to be these sort of, you know, but they don't have the sort of abstraction ability or abstraction skill naturally to just go, oh, there needs to be it needs to be straight with a bend to represent that, and the joint needs, it needs to be jointed in this way, and so on and so forth. People are conventional when it comes to things like art. People are kind of it's I compare it to singing in the shower. When you're singing a song in the shower, you're not doing a no perfect version unless you've got that sort of ability. Now you're doing your best sort of recollection. What your ear could hear of it, what sounds right to you in terms of the pitch and in terms of the tempo. You're kind of recovering things based on what your brain was able to pick up, and this is an important thing, I think, in terms of memory and cognition as a whole, is that we can only look for what we know to look for. Really, we tend to pick up on those things that either experience or somebody's teaching us has taught us to grasp. Like a person who's been taught something about music can pick out the pitches, and with a finer degree they can pick out the chords that the person uses rather than just assume it's a smashed together note. They can pick out the rhythm of what they're saying, the starts, the stops, the way that comes together. You know, it's a matter of what perception isn't just you know perception is not just about you know some objective thing being out there and your brain just literally recording that in a studio behind your eyes. No, your brain can only recover what it's capable of setting down in some sort of pattern. So, as a person who is on the spectrum, my experience in my life, well, I guess what I can read what I wrote here. My experience is that I can abstract, that my brain has a difficult time paring down the elements of the abstraction. Just to say, I don't throw away. When you do that, when a kid does that simple model of a house, the box with the triangle on top as the roof, they're doing a simple sort of symbolic abstraction of it. But maybe the autistic kid goes, well, there's this other sort of overhang here, and there's this sort of angle up here. They might not be able to throw away. When a kid does that sort of, it's somewhat true, isn't it? If you look at many houses, that is the basic structure. You have a, sort of walls like this, you know, viewed from front, and then you have a roof that kind of slopes off to let you know rain and snow and other precipitation fall off. And that's not unusual. It's and so you can abstract down to that sort of detail. But if you're on the autism spectrum, you might look at that and just be sort of I don't think I can properly do this if I don't include this line right here. And It may be more of a matter of being finicky about what details you are willing or able to throw away. Um, and that can affect that sort of you know problem with how you abstract. It's not simply that I can't abstract things. I can abstract things perfectly well. I can break them down to simpler concepts and create models of what I'm doing. I mean, that's how I organize the way I've composed this. I've got, if you'll notice, right about here, I've got one line going, and right about here, I have my face and everything. I've also organized things to where I've got sort of a certain amount of headroom, and also so that my shoulders fall out of shot with, making it less of a sort of a talking head sort of thing. So I can abstract things. I can in fact do some forms of abstraction, but I've got a more picky mind about it. And it's more difficult for me to throw away things to kind of lighten the cognitive load. So it might be more difficult for me to kind of break things down and then recover stuff for myself from that. You know, let more experience teach me rather than needing a more sort of nuanced presentation. So yeah, I mean, and let's see. And then there's the part where he talks about, that we don't like people because they don't fit into the our cognitive boxes. I can tell you from personal experience that I actually do like people, and I do like being around people. The feeling may not necessarily be mutual sometimes, um, given my awkwardness with others, but for the most part, I want to be around other people and I like to be around other people. It's just difficult and exhausting, and um, I can't always work with people as gracefully as I would like, as gracefully as I see other people working with each other. I mean, I see a lot of things, I see a lot of what normal behavior looks like, but it's sort of my brain just it's one thing to observe others, to observe how other people will normally behave. It's another thing to look at that and bring back a sort of a bring back a sort of, I guess, essentialized abstract nugget of how that means I should behave. I might make the wrong assumption. I might abstract the wrong lesson out of that. Because I can be taught, how to be, how to say please and thank you. I can be taught to moderate my tone, to kind of be, not to be, mean to people. I can be taught these things. It's sort of more like the more difficult sort of unwritten sort of rules. which are unwritten because let's be blunt, not everything that we do is an abstraction of what somebody else did. Some of what we do is a result of experience, personal experience, and understanding that personal experience and what its significance is. Um, it's like this is part of, I think, the intuition of social skills. Um, when I talk to you, it's like I'm sort of trying to process and gauge what is, how are you, I look at your face, your, I listen to your words when I let you get in a word edgewise. I try and gauge, okay, what did this person take away from what I said? I need to do that as much as anybody else does, especially if I'm working a job and I'm trying to get others to understand what what I'm talking about. Um, but it's more like, what if you had a disorder that meant that you could walk, but you had to consciously think your way through your balance and equilibrium. You'd have to consciously place your feet, consciously, move yourself forward, rather than just being able to take the cerebellar route of being able to naturally coordinate it with your senses. So people have a sense in, they call it mirror neurons. There is a part of their brain that activates when they are dealing with other people, that lets them sort of have a parallel sort of, I guess, version of the other person's thinking, or at least, I guess, a derivation that kind of, I mean, it's at least a feedback. I wouldn't necessarily think of it being a perfect reflection of what's in the other person's brain, but rather a somewhat accurate feedback of how that other person might be thinking, how the other person might be feeling. And having that, they can respond to that by going, "Oh, he's not looking too pleased about that. I might need to flatter them, or da 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 da." Only it's much more fine grained. If you've got something that allows you to kind of gauge through personal experience what somebody else is, how somebody else is doing something, or how somebody else is figuring something out, then that can be an aid to learning from that person. That can be an aid to negotiating with that person. That you have this sort of feedback mechanism that allows you to kind of gauge what you're doing on the fly. And so, whereas I, being the way I am, I need more information. I need to look and see more things. I need more practice on my own. I need to, pardon me, just had lunch not too long ago, so it's coming back for a visit. Um, but long story short, when you have that sort of facility to, you're learning things. They can learn things. They don't necessarily have to abstract everything. Abstracting is a particular cognitive skill. they could reconstruct more. They can do more in the way of, guessing how the other person was going about things, from their point of view. They can, whereas I'm having to kind of gauge things with that part of my perception missing. And so I have to actually do more abstraction, actually do more of the deconstruction and reconstruction. I have to figure out more of the principles by which it works so then I can rebuild it in my own mind, reinvent the wheel a lot in my own mind so that I can actually function. That's the thing. That's what I think makes autism something of a disability is that sort of issue with being able to with having to reconstruct what other people can more easily figure out through intuition, through a mirroring of other people's thought processes, through more intuitive methods, through more fault tolerant methods. I mean, that said, because I do think I have to build up a lot of things from the ground up, understanding wise, that can have some advantages if what other people are learning is largely conventional, largely the result of them, just copying what other people have done before them. They don't necessarily have to analyze things the way I have to analyze things to even function with what I learned. So I am forced to do something that might lead me to innovate, that might lead me to be faster at doing something, even though learning it initially was slower and more cumbersome. That's, I think, some of the value that can come from people who aren't, quote unquote, neurotypical, is that by being forced to rethink things in order to understand them at all, they are forced to to take a different look at something that may not have been looked at deeply in the first place. And so it's not that we are lacking in the ability to abstract, it's that we are forced to abstract in a different way with different tools, and that we have to be more careful about how we judge our perceptions because some part of our perceptions are unreliable, or don't kind of result in a solid sort of read on what's going on. So that's my personal experience. Um, as for consistency, what is it about consistency that appeals to an autistic person? Um, okay, let's see. Well, here's what I wrote. We all have some degree of need for consistency. If you come home and your whole house has been remodeled without your knowledge or permission, you would feel a bit bewildered, even angry. What happened? You would want to even demand to know. I must confess, I don't like surprises. I do like routines. It's easier for me to feel lost and like I don't have a solid grasp on what's going on if there are changes to the environment, which doesn't mean I can't adapt. It's just more psychologically distressing. And if, not every autistic person is the same, not every autistic person has an equal amount of cognitive or personal ability to deal with that. but it is there we understand the environment differently, I think is one way of putting it. And we sort of relate to the environment, I would suggest, the way, you might relate to a person. It's like there are elements of, we have strategies for dealing with our environment. We have strategies for living our life that depend on the environment being a certain way. Um, we have certain regularities that we desire, but so do you. So do you. You have certain attributes to the environment that you like, that you want to be the way they are, and that if they aren't that way, you get to be a bit, put out. I continued. Ironically, there may be a flip side to this in terms of when one senses a change in continuity. If your notion of America, I'm a fairly political person, so don't take this personally. If your notion of America, for example, is built on Leave It to Beaver and Levittown, which is a reference to a sort of a prototypical suburban community with every house the same. I think it was in New Jersey. It may have been Pennsylvania. Um, you you might not recognize today's America as the America you remember, but if your sense of America is built on the principles of freedom, equality, and the fulfillment of philosophical premises of self-government and representation, then today's America, the woker America, might seem like a positive evolution, while efforts to force old prejudices and old cultures on that might seem the true and insidious disruption of who we are. And that's that's the thing about it. It's we all have different reads on the environment, different sort of cross sections of how we look at thing and say that thing is the same, or that person, despite the fact they've grown older, is the same person. You recognize things about that person. You recognize things about how they behave. Um, as far as complexity goes, I tend to not overlook disanalogies. I'm intelligent enough to know. I mean, he goes into sort of this level of analysis sort of thing where he's got these squares up that have smaller squares in them and smaller still, and he sort of puts a series of um, representations of that see it at different levels of detail. Um, and I go on to say, I tend to not overlook disanalogies. I'm intelligent enough to know that churches come in different shapes and sizes of certain uh, common features. I think it's important to draw a distinction on the basis of severity of autistic effects. I'm pickier about models of abstraction than other people are. In this way, it may be less that I don't abstract well, and more that I don't abstract things in a way that feels comfortably intuitive to others, which is to say that I might organize my categories, the levels of details. I might construct my models of things in a way that doesn't necessarily fit with other people. Now, when other people, put their models of the world together, they often do so in a way that kind of lets them have sort of a common language of a common shorthand of other people. But that doesn't mean that my models are less sophisticated or less accurate or that theirs are. but that just that we're going to look at things with a different kind of perspective on what details matter and what details don't. Um, and I sort of my comment is, he's not tackling this or my handwriting is, I'm di it tells you something that part of my original diagnosis was dysgraphia. The inability to properly write crap. Yeah, yeah, he's not. I guess he's not tackling this in a very organized way. Let's see, the way we parse things. I like Robert Persig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. His idea of analysis working like a cross section. There are many ways you can slice a given object or situation in order to properly fit one's analytical needs. Like if you're looking at the exhaust system on a bike, if you're looking at the engine, if you're looking at the electrical system, there are different parts that, if you're trying to troubleshoot what's going wrong with a particular machine that you want to look at. I'm by profession a computer technician. So one of the first things that I'm going to ask you, for example, if I don't, the computer seems to be not responsive. One of the first things to check, of course, is the monitor. If the monitor is shut off or unplugged, then which is a hazard in my particular workplace, because people will want to plug in their cell phones to charge them, and they don't necessarily care about other people's convenience. Um, but long story short, the there's things like, okay, is the computer actually on? That's one question that doesn't always get answered. People might assume that this machine is on, but they haven't looked at the power button, which, in fairness, on some models, the light, the power light isn't necessarily, easily visible in full sunlight. Um, the There's also different reasons why something might not be working the way we want it to work. There it can range from there being a bad monitor to there being a loose or you know, improperly seated cable, to there being just simply problems with the the programming. Either a driver, you know, the program in the computer that talks to a particular a peripheral, like a monitor or a mouse or a keyboard, and kind of translates things for the central processing unit. There is there are any number. When I look at a computer that isn't isn't working, I'm looking at any number of reasons why that might not be the case. Why the system is failing to work. And so that's part of level of analysis. But also, it's not just about the level of detail. It it is also about salience. It's also about whether or not a particular detail matters. Um, Cables almost always matter. If a power cable is not fully plugged in, it won't work. if a if if like a VGA cable, those old-fashioned VGA cables that only recently have fallen out of fashion. If you didn't have it all the way screwed in all the way, it wouldn't necessarily work. It wouldn't necessarily give you all the colors that you needed. And so, if a pardon me, if your power strip on the floor, if the plug isn't all the way in, if the power strip itself is failing, or if the particular socket is burnt out, there are any number of reasons why you won't get what you want out of that computer. And understanding how things work together. Like if you're dealing with a situation where a computer isn't turning on, you have to go from that plug, from the plug for the power strip to the plug for the what's plugged into the power strip to the back of the computer, and then into the computer you need to check that power supply. It's a logical chain of steps that you know or if you want quickly, if you want quickly, troubleshoot the monitor first, because maybe the monitor is the problem. Troubleshoot you know, because the monitor, if the monitor isn't working, a lot of times people will assume that that is the fault of the CPU. When the CPU is happily churning out visual data, it's just not getting to something that's on or able to, you know, portray that visual data. The computer might be chugging along, minding its own business, doing what it's supposed to do, but the monitor's gone out, and because the monitor's gone out, it looks like the whole computer's gone out. It you know you understand there is a sort of things are connected to each other, and so when we analyze things, when we abstract things, we need to abstract in a way that understands this and throws away the right kinds of information and keeps the right kinds of information. So the way I put it is, knowing what info you can throw out or exclude from attention at a given moment is a valuable thing. You can apply the most brain power to the smallest quantity of information without sacrificing good results. In other words, you know, we have limited sort of cognitive resources at any one given time. We have limits to how much we can consciously process at a time. And so, if we can limit what we're actually having to pay attention to, what we're actually trying to look at, if we can, reduce things to a pattern, that's a good thing. That is what helps us understand the situation and deal with it better. Um, because not every, people confuse information and meaning. So it's important to realize that intelligence is an evolved trait. Now, that might offend some people who are more religious, particularly creationists, but think about it in terms of, if God is, if you want to think about it in terms of a God, how God created man, then think about it in terms of God creating man to survive, even in times where he didn't have science to help him survive in a more sophisticated way. So God wants us to be able to feed ourselves, to find shelter, to satisfy all the needs. Organizing, the way I put it is, finding food, finding you know shelter and protection from the elements, water, organizing with others, remembering and avoiding hazards, uh, contending with potential rivals and allies. You know, sometimes we try and pretend like, there isn't any true disability in being, on the autism spectrum. But the more I look at it, the more I see that there are useful elements to having better social skills, better social neural systems, as I put it, systems for intuiting and perceiving what others are going to do. There is some truth to the notion he's pushing of having a composing, decomposing transference of info, but what he's perhaps neglecting is that this is not universal. What am I saying? Um, we have different languages, different different customs, different interpretations of social behavior uh, among the different cultures in different parts of the world. In other words, not everybody has that same pattern. They have the social skills and but not necessarily the same pattern of how they work from that. One famous example is social distance. In some places you want to be stood far apart, or otherwise people might think you're being a bit intrusive. While in others, you want to be you know, practically in their face, or they might think you're being a bit, well, distant. So there are different sort of customs, different things, and they've evolved over time, among people as they have interacted with each other separately, as they have been influenced by different people within the community, as different conditions and different, you know, things have gone on in their society. Um, they have, you know, this is, as people, I mean, genes, when they evolve because people are breeding, or creatures are breeding in populations that are apart from one another. And because we're working from inherited changes in genes, and that's what evolution, what natural selection selects through, sorts through, sorts out the winners and the losers. But it's different places, so you'll have different inherited sort of adaptations in one place as opposed to another. And the brain side of this, the neurological side of this, the education of a society, of social customs, of how people figured things out, well, of course, that's going to vary from place to place. They're going to have different attitudes about things like, you know, how hard are you supposed to work? I mean, in a place where it's hot during a certain part of the day, they think it's strange that people would be out trying to work in the middle of the day. They find it sort of you know dumb, because to them, that's the hottest part of the day. You want to rest and relax. You want to be inside, take a nap. They shift a lot of their behavior, their activity towards the nights when it's cooler. Now that looks strange to somebody who's coming from Great Britain, for example, which is at a higher latitude, and so the days are shorter. So you want to get things done while the getting is good. You want to do things in the middle of the day, when things are warmer, when things, I know that's probably a generalization and doesn't necessarily reflect how things really did occur, but it's, you know, we for much of human history, we lived separately, and so we dealt with things separately, and so we, sort of just, you know, evolved different ways of dealing with the world, and that's why we have different cultures. And so, and this is the interface. This is I speak of it as an interface, a dance, a game, which is to say that we let's I look I compare it to having different operating systems. Like you have a model of computer with Linux on it, and you have the same model of computer, but it's running Windows. So each, the same computer can run different software in terms of how it puts things together, in terms of how it works, how it responds to input, what output it gives. So that's comparison of cultures and languages. These are things that are kind of they they're kind of worked on as sort of agreements of the kind. We agree this means this. We agree this means that. And it's not so much of a conscious agreement as just, when you're a kid and you're taught language by your parents, and then you speak with your peers, and you have a certain way you speak with your peers, just as your parents have a certain way that they speak with their peers. And so over time, you got this interface that changes because people are changing. In fact, that's one element of why things change over time in terms of language and culture is that, well, we are born, we live, and we die. We are, we are born into a certain cohort of individuals. We live with those people, grow up with those people. We understand the experience of those people in the way that we neither, that your older generation doesn't necessarily understand them, and the younger generation doesn't understand the older generation's experience either in that sort of intuitive manner. It's a natural sort of outgrowth of the fact that human beings are grown and not just instantly manufactured. We come into existence over time through a process of development, and we develop alongside others. We communicate to those people, we interact with, we socially deal with those people. And so, let's see. It's sort of, and of course, people try and prevent that from happening. They try and keep everything the same. But I invoke entropy on it, and I think in this case it's not inappropriate because information has its sort of entropy. It's order tends to disorder, and you have this nice organized sense of how things relate, and then over time it kind of falls apart. But then, because this is a natural sort of system, there is a new order that is grown and then falls apart itself. But also, a new generation comes along after that, and sort of, you have this sort of process of people coming, booting up from childhood, so to speak, booting up from childhood into adulthood, developing and the development is pretty much the same from one generation to the next, but each generation has the task of kind of having to learn from the generation that came before it and then sort of operate on their own. And this is sort of as a game, it's something that people there's a sort of a voluntary element to it, and I wish it wasn't necessarily this so sometimes, because it's sometimes inordinately hard to get people to do rational things, like for example, deal with COVID as if it's a real threat, as if it's a real problem. And you can tell what my political point of view is on, you know, but it's like, how do you get other people to agree? How do you get other people to work with you? And not being able necessarily to play the game, um, the political game, the psychological game, you know, I mean, there is ironically a problem where some of the people who have the clearest perspective on certain problems are ignored because they simply aren't the best networkers, aren't the best, you know, you know, aren't necessarily the best social operators, and so their ideas don't necessarily get appreciated at the best time. Which is, not me saying that my ideas are uniquely good. That's just, it's a problem of some of our best experts are, in fact, people who have sort of, you know, neurodivergence. Mm, It, but part of what I would note is a problem for people like Jordan Peterson is that they're kind of stuck inside their particular um, orbit of they're kind of stuck inside their interface, their version of the game. They think that theirs is a that they have a lock on how things really are, on what they think of language as being something that is solid and foundational, and that you can kind of just build everything on top of it as if it is axiomatic, as if logic itself can flow from just getting all the words straight and getting all the all their reasoning straight. And the problem is it's an imperfect interface. Um, it's an imperfect interface, and it's not. We can be, all the things we're trying to learn over time, all the things that we're trying to, all the complexity that we're trying to deal with, all the order that we want in order to, keep things safe and predictable, and you know feeling like the familiar stuff that we want things to feel like, all these things that we take for granted as being solid, it's in fact just something of an agreement, of a tie, a set of ties, a set of systems that we develop between each other. And that can be a bewildering thing to realize, a bewildering thing to understand, especially for somebody like me. I mean, somebody like me we want everything to be about something that is solid and that can be built on from the ground up to make sense on a fundamental level and make sense all the way through. But the problem is, we're not perfect creatures, and intelligence itself is an organically based, you know, provisionally evolved thing that is doomed to struggle with the true nature of the world. We are doomed to struggle with the true nature of the world, whether we're autistic or not. We just struggle in different ways. The replacement of the present and future generations of their elders is always an imperfect one. The game that your kids play will be their own to some degree and must be, or otherwise, they're not really learning to exist on their own. No generation can survive in the wild if it needs the previous generation to stage, manage, helicopter their lives. Adam and Eve must leave the walls of paradise and the care of God's protection, and so children must leave their parents' care and build lives without adult supervision. I know some folks might look at that and kind of note that my life circumstances are different, but that's part of the one part of maybe that's something I realize from bad experience more than from good example. Therefore, the necessity of the ability to absorb the rules and regulations of the social game. If one fails to understand the framework sufficiently well, one can fail to thrive in the environment. At the same time, I would state that it's also important to have those that don't share the same framework of understanding within the society. There are by nature, we are by nature a learning species. We have to learn how to, we have very long childhoods, and it's part of the fact that we take so long to teach and bring up our children. The temptation is to adopt a prototypical notion of neurotypical thought. The idea of the ideal functional average of all human brains. The idea that there is this sort of prototypical human brain and that when it functions, that's the way it's supposed to go. This should be rejected. Our brains are more like the car engines at a meeting of gearheads. Everybody's car a different kind, from vintage muscle car to modern East Asian import, each with different modifications and settings. We can look at depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, and autism as extreme modifications that produce high performance in one set of cognitive traits, but mediocre to disastrous performance elsewhere. It's not all problems are adaptive. Not all problems serve a purpose. Um, but you know, if we're an evolved species, that means that what we have is a population. Okay, we have a population that's been breeding individuals of people that have been passing back and forth, different genes, and each one of us has a unique collection of those genes. Minus perhaps identical twins or triplets or whatever. Um, and because of that, um, we all have a different assortment of traits up here. Now, that there is, sort of a limited number of such traits, and limited number of configurations. And of course, not all these traits perform unique or unrelated functions. So you have clusters of genes, clusters of neurological, I guess, points of failure or points of network or whatever. But the idea that I'm trying to present here, there was a thing a while back. The Air Force had sort of a problem with people crashing their jets, and it seemed to be because the controls weren't necessarily where they needed to be for that person. And so they decided they wanted to find out what the average person was. So they took all these measurements. They took all these measurements of all these different sort of physical, measurements of, you know, what the person's height, the length of the person's arms, fingers, the way their torso was constructed, and they found out something very curious. While most people had two or three things about them that were average, most of their most of them departed from the average in other respects. It turns out that the person who is average in all things is actually one of the more elusive figures in the real world. That the actual average man is a bit of a fairy tale. Which is to say that I believe the same would probably hold true if we measured people's brains. That in fact, most people probably depart from the average traits of neurology in most ways. That there is that people are actually much more individual than they give themselves credit for. And because of this, like I was saying, we are like we have our brains are like those car engines of different brands of car with different, sort of parts, different sort of tunings, different sort of settings, and because of that, we all have something about us that's not neurotypical. It's just that there's a sort of, I guess, a curve of sorts where, if you are within a certain range of function, you are judged to be, you know, you were judged to have a healthy sort of brain. And that's, I think, important for us when we're looking at people who have autism spectrum disorders or schizophrenia or depression or bipolar disorder. If we're looking at people who have obsessive compulsive disorder, uh, we have to recognize, I think, that there are things going on that tell us something about we need to be more generous and more forgiving with ourselves instead of looking at that autistic person as if they're missing something, that makes them less, instead of just looking at it as something that is only there to be overcome so that they can live a normal life. Well, perhaps we should be more concerned about, you know, handling what it is that doesn't quite work about, you know, how their brain works, but at the same time, recognizing what might work better about their brain. what might work better about the way they look at the world, looking at, using their abilities, training their abilities so that they make the best of who they actually are, instead of trying to fit them into the cockpit of the quote unquote average human being. Because even the average human being, if you really look at it, doesn't fit that mold, doesn't fit that particular cockpit. That's why, in fact, so many, if you look at it, so many cars and jets and other sort of systems. That's why there's so much adjustable on those these days. That's why you can adjust your seat. That's why you can adjust your steering wheel and your all these things, because people figured out that in reality human beings weren't simply representatives of some prototype prototypical body. Instead, they are representatives of many different parallel existence, you know, many different body sizes and shapes in parallel existence. And we have many different kinds of brains, many different kinds of thinking and looking at the world that exist in parallel. And we can either mourn the fact that not everybody is on the same page, not everybody looks at things the same way, or we can take advantage of that. We can take advantage of that and use that to better solve the problems that we are faced with as a society. Deal, teaching people how to, you know, how to manage different skills, how to excel at different elements of what we as a society need for people to learn. We can't all be the average. In fact, almost nobody can be the average that we desire. And so rather than go mad trying to stuff humanity into that box, we should recognize that we we should recognize that we have a whole lot more tools, for cognition, for looking at the world than we actually recognize at the moment. We have so many more different ways we can look at the way the world works. And we're not using them because we're really not focusing on how it can benefit somebody, or, we're so concerned about how people are maladaptive, that to a sort of a central sort of illusion of the average, that we fail to take advantage of what's right in front of us. We don't need everybody to be the same. Okay, so that's it for this presentation. That's it for my response. You know, my call to you, whoever, if anybody, watches this, my call to you would be, figure out what unique opportunities that you can seize in this world and take advantage of that. Be Don't strive to be average. Strive to be yourself and good at it. Thank you very much and have a good day.